Hello, and a very warm welcome back to all our UPSC aspirants tuning in to this Rungta IAS Academy Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really crucial paper that just came out in the BMJ Global Health Journal. If you're preparing for GS Paper 2, especially the International Relations segment, the insights here regarding the IMF and the World Bank are an absolute must-know. Let's get right into it.
Thank you, sir. All right, aspirants. Before we even look at the data, I want you to set your analytical framework for today's session. Imagine sitting in the exam hall and seeing this exact mock mains question in front of you. Critically examine the legacy of IMF and World Bank's structural adjustment programs on the Global South. Keep this prompt at the back of your mind because everything we discuss today is exactly what you'll need to structure a high-scoring standout answer.
Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1, the origin of SAPs. Now, a strong mains essay always begins with solid historical context. Look at the timeline here. The post-colonial period between 1960 and 1980 was actually a period of steady progress. Developing nations were investing heavily in their own industries, and real per capita income across the Global South was growing. But then, a massive external shock hit. In the late 1970s, the U.S. Federal Reserve sharply hiked up interest rates. Literally overnight, countries that had borrowed heavily in foreign currencies were looking at ballooning, unmanageable repayments. To prevent mass defaults to American banks, the U.S. intervened through the IMF and World Bank in the 1980s to roll over these debts. But, and this is the critical catch, they attached incredibly strict, sweeping economic conditions. Spot on, madam. And aspirants, you absolutely must memorize the 3 core pillars of these structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. First up is austerity. This meant slashing vital public spending on things like healthcare, education, and food subsidies, all so that money could be freed up to flow back to Western creditors. Second, privatization, essentially transferring state-owned services straight to private capital. And third, deregulation. This meant stripping away domestic industrial policies, tariffs, and crucial labor protections. Ultimately, these 3 pillars reverse decades of developmental gains, making Southern labor and resources incredibly cheap for Western firms all over again. Moving straight into Section 2, social and economic setbacks. When writing the main body of your answer, you need to show this stark economic contrast. Look at the numbers. Before the SAPs, economic growth in the Global South averaged a very healthy 3.2% annually. But once the SAP era hit in the 1980s and 90s, that growth completely plummeted to a mere 0.7%. The human cost here was just staggering. The paper highlights that real income per adult fell by nearly 15% in Latin America after 1980, and it fell by nearly 20% in sub-Saharan Africa. We are talking about decades of hard-fought progress just wiped out. Aspirants, I want you to literally highlight this massive figure in your notes. $480 billion. According to the research, this was the average potential national income lost per year collectively by the Global South during this structural adjustment period. Dropping specific, verified data points like this from credible journals is exactly what catches the examiner's eye and makes your paper highly scoring. And you have to remember, the damage wasn't just on balance sheets. It manifested as a severe, real-world public health crisis. Drastic budget cuts to health sectors and the introduction of user fees led to an additional 85.62 child deaths for every 1,000 children, and an extra 360 maternal deaths per 1 lakh live births in sub-Saharan Africa. Over in Jamaica, currency devaluation caused massive, sharp spikes in everyday food prices. Meanwhile, the forced removal of capital controls allowed foreign companies to extract up to $250 billion a year in repatriated profits. So you have wealth being actively generated in developing nations, but it's flowing directly right out to the global north. Let's transition now to Section 3, Obstacles and Global Alternatives. To construct a really compelling way forward in your answer, you have to critically analyze this built-in structural inequality. The authors of the paper actually argue for reparations, but there are immense procedural roadblocks in the governance structure of Bretton Woods institutions. Just look at this glaring hypocrisy. The global north has barely 15% of the world's population, yet it controls nearly 60% of the voting power. On top of that, the U.S. alone holds veto power, and both institutions enjoy sovereign immunity. That means they are completely shielded from standard legal lawsuits for the socioeconomic damage their policies have caused.
Precisely, sir. And to wrap up your essays on a highly analytical, forward-looking note, you should point out that the world is already shifting away from this old framework. Emerging alternatives from the global south, like the BRICS New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, are providing essential finance, but crucially, they attach absolutely no structural adjustment conditions. This is a game changer. It represents a major evolution in international relations because it actually respects the sovereignty and domestic policy space of the borrowing nations.
And that brings us to the end of today's analysis. For your upcoming UPSC interview stage, we want to leave you with a rather provocative question to ponder. Should international institutions continue to enjoy sovereign immunity against the real socioeconomic damage their policies cause? It's definitely a complex issue, but it's one you're now thoroughly equipped to tackle. Keep studying hard, aspirants. Make sure you review these critical data points, and we wish you the absolute best in your preparation. Thank you for joining us on this explainer.